The heavy brass tip of Evelyn Montgomery's polished oak cane struck the imported marble floor with a sharp, resonant crack that echoed through the grand foyer of the Montgomery estate. Outside, the autumn breeze carried a gentle mist over the rolling hills of the Hudson Valley in upstate New York. But inside the great library, the air was cold, still, and suffocating. Evelyn sat upright in her high-backed velvet armchair, her silver hair coiled with immaculate grace, her dark eyes fixed with unwavering resolve upon her grandson. Beside the long mahogany table, the family estate attorney, Arthur Vance, had already broken the wax seal on the final envelope left behind by the late patriarch, Charles Montgomery. Yet, the moment the cane struck the stone, Arthur's hand froze above the parchment, his fountain pen resting untouched on the green leather desk blotter. Julian Montgomery sat on the oversized leather sofa, his legs crossed with effortless arrogance, radiating the casual confidence of an heir apparent who believed the world owed him its absolute deference. At 34 years old, he carried the Montgomery jawline and an impeccable tailored suit, but none of the gentle humility that had made his grandfather beloved by the entire county. Sitting close beside him was Victoria Cross, adorned in an ivory designer dress, her golden necklace catching the dim chandelier light, as she offered the room a carefully rehearsed, polished smile. Julian let out a faint, dismissive chuckle, resting his arm along the sofa's backrest, convinced that this morning was merely a formal crowning. He truly believed he was about to inherit the family shipping empire, take complete charge of the sprawling Hudson Valley estate, and permanently close the book on his fractured marriage to Clara Caldwell. The silence stretched until Julian leaned forward, a condescending smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as he adjusted his diamond-encrusted cufflinks. He explained in an even, indifferent tone that Clara had packed her bags weeks ago, that she was currently renting a modest brownstone in Brooklyn, and that her presence was entirely unnecessary for Montgomery business. Victoria glanced down at her manicured nails, subtly tucking away a smirk of triumph, taking his words as a public declaration that the former Mrs. Montgomery had been erased from their high society circle. But Evelyn did not flinch, nor did she blink. She merely shifted her gaze across the expanse of the room toward an empty, hand-carved mahogany chair positioned directly across from her. With a voice that cut sharper than a winter frost, the matriarch declared that the empty chair belonged exclusively to her grandson's lawful wife, and until Clara walked through those double oak doors, not a single page would be turned. A low murmur of uneasy anticipation rippled through the distant relatives and senior board members scattered throughout the room, their eyes darting nervously between the matriarch and the heir. For nearly a year, whispers of Julian's brazen public affair with Victoria had circulated through the country clubs of Manhattan and the quiet estates of Dutchess County, though no one had dared utter a word in Charles Montgomery's presence while his health deteriorated. Bringing his mistress directly into the solemn reading of his grandfather's last will and testament was already a grotesque act of disrespect, but Evelyn's ironclad ultimatum suddenly stripped away Julian's facade of total control. Arthur Vance, honoring the matriarch's instruction, slowly slid the legal documents back into his leather briefcase, clasped the brass lock shut, and folded his hands patiently across his lap. Julian's jaw clenched, the easy charm vanishing from his eyes as he leaned closer to his grandmother, demanding to know why she was turning a straightforward corporate succession into a public theater. Evelyn did not offer the dignity of an argument. She simply motioned to the head butler, Thomas, a man who had served the Montgomery family for over 40 years, instructing him to call Clara immediately. Sensing the shift in the room, Victoria attempted to intervene with a soft, patronizing tone, suggesting that it was perhaps cruel to drag a bitter, estranged woman back into a house she had willingly abandoned. Evelyn turned her head with agonizing slowness, her piercing gaze sweeping over Victoria as if observing an unsightly stain upon a pristine tablecloth, cutting her off instantly by reminding her that uninvited guests were neither asked to speak nor welcome to offer counsel. Julian stiffened, feeling the sting of the insult as if it had been directed squarely at his own face, yet he dared not openly challenge the woman who still held the legal reins of the household. Just 3 months prior, the sprawling hallways of the estate had echoed with a very different rhythm, back when Clara still walked those polished floors, believing their crumbling marriage was a victim of work stress rather than deliberate betrayal. In those final months, while Charles Montgomery's heart weakened and his breath grew shallow, Clara had been the only one who spent her afternoons in his sunlit study. She did not do it out of expectation or to secure a place in his ledger. She came with cups of hot herbal tea, organized his vast collection of American history volumes, and sat quietly, listening to an old man reflect on a life filled with monumental triumphs and quiet, haunting regrets. Charles had spoken very little about his multi-million-dollar maritime logistics empire during those long, quiet Hudson Valley afternoons, choosing instead to talk about the dangers of confusing authority with genuine affection. Clara had listened attentively, sensing the deep sadness beneath the old man's raspy voice, never suspecting that those intimate conversations were his way of preparing her for an inevitable goodbye. Julian, by contrast, had rarely visited his grandfather during those final, fragile days, constantly traveling between business meetings in Chicago, Boston, and Miami, always finding an excuse to leave before the evening meal was served. Whenever Charles asked about his grandson's whereabouts, Clara would gently defend her husband, assuring the patriarch that Julian was merely overwhelmed by the immense pressure of his corporate responsibilities, hiding the painful truth behind a veil of patient loyalty. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, as Clara drew the heavy velvet drapes to shield the dying man's eyes from the gray autumn glare, Charles had looked at her with tired, sorrowful eyes, and asked if Julian truly appreciated the woman standing by his side. Clara had offered a faint, reassuring smile, swallowing the painful lump in her throat, claiming that their bond was strong even if work kept them temporarily apart. The old patriarch had reached out, patting her hand with trembling fingers, whispering with profound sadness that she had spent years protecting a man who never stayed around long enough to see her sacrifices. Clara had remained silent in that dimly lit study, still clinging to the naive belief that preserving a marriage meant hiding its deepest fractures from the outside world, completely unaware that the betrayal had already taken root far beyond the walls of the estate. The first signs of Julian's infidelity had appeared long before Clara was willing to admit them to herself. Unfamiliar floral perfume lingering on the lapel of his cashmere coats, sudden hushed telephone calls that ended the second she entered the room, and weekend business trips whose itineraries never matched the company logs. When Clara finally gathered the courage to ask him directly on a quiet evening in their private quarters, Julian had reacted with instant hostility, accusing her of petty jealousy, and declaring that questioning his schedule was an insult to his character. He had warned her that he would never justify his whereabouts to an insecure woman, leaving Clara standing alone in the hallway, more ashamed of having spoken up than comforted by his hollow defense. The illusion shattered entirely 3 weeks later when an anonymous envelope arrived at the estate, containing glossy photographs of Julian emerging from an upscale restaurant in Manhattan, his hand resting intimately on Victoria's waist as they stepped into a waiting town car. Clara had stared at the photographs for nearly an hour beneath the cold kitchen lights, not shedding a single tear, not throwing a tantrum, but feeling a profound, chilling clarity settle deep within her soul. When Julian finally returned home past midnight, tossing his car keys onto the mahogany dresser, Clara laid the photographs before him and quietly asked how long he had been living a double life. Julian did not even bother to fabricate an excuse. He casually unbuttoned his collar and coldly declared that their marriage had been dead for years, claiming that Clara had grown comfortable living off the prestige of the Montgomery name and would never have the courage to walk away from such immense luxury. Clara did not cry before him that night. She merely stood tall, looked into the eyes of the man she had loved for nearly a decade, and told him never to mistake her patience for weakness or dependency. From that moment forward, the atmosphere within the Montgomery estate shifted into a quiet, dignified separation, with Clara moving her belongings into the guest wing and refusing to share his table. Meanwhile, Victoria became increasingly bolder, accompanying Julian to high-profile charity galas in Manhattan and private dinners, subtly cementing her presence in his public life, while Clara prepared her quiet departure. Julian seemed to relish the Cold War, convinced that Clara's silence was merely a tactical prelude to hysterical tears, desperate threats, or astronomical alimony demands. Yet she did none of those things. Instead, Clara quietly consulted a reputable family attorney in White Plains, reviewed her premarital assets, and methodically organized her exit without touching a single cent from the joint Montgomery accounts. Her absolute calm baffled Julian far more than any dramatic shouting match ever could, as he was entirely accustomed to people using every weapon at their disposal to secure a portion of his family's immense wealth. Charles Montgomery had noticed the profound shift before anyone else. One morning over breakfast, seeing that Clara's left hand no longer bore her platinum wedding band, the old man asked if she would still visit him if she were no longer his grandson's wife. With tears welling in her eyes, Clara had promised that genuine affection required no legal contract or family title, a simple answer that prompted the dying patriarch to quietly summon his attorney to revise the documents that very afternoon. When rumors reached Julian that his grandfather was revising certain succession documents, the young heir arrogantly assumed it was the final step in transferring the entire estate and corporate empire into his sole custody. That evening, over an extravagant dinner at a private rooftop club in Manhattan, Julian openly bragged to Victoria about the vast real estate holdings, maritime fleets, and trust funds that would soon fall under his absolute command. Victoria had listened with predatory fascination, her eyes gleaming as she asked what would become of Clara once the divorce papers were finalized, prompting Julian to laugh arrogantly and claim that Clara would leave with nothing. Egged on by Victoria's venomous reassurances, Julian began to view Clara's gentle care for his grandfather as a calculated scheme to siphon away his inheritance, eventually confronting her in the hallway with vile accusations of manipulation. 2 days after that baseless accusation, Clara packed her belongings into 3 simple leather suitcases, taking only her premarital clothes, personal journals, and family heirlooms, refusing to take a single piece of jewelry Julian had bought to appease his guilt. Evelyn had entered the bedroom just as Clara was zipping her final bag, sitting quietly by the window, offering no empty platitudes but asking only if Julian knew she was leaving that morning. Clara had gently replied that she refused to leave in the middle of another meaningless screaming match, thanking the elderly woman for treating her like a daughter through all those tumultuous years. As Clara reached the grand foyer, Julian stood blocking the double doors, a mocking smirk on his lips as he asked how much money she wanted to end the charade, warning her that she would crawl back the moment she realized what she was losing in the real world. Clara had paused on the threshold, turning to look at her husband with an expression of profound, weary pity, delivering the words that would forever echo in his mind. She told him she already knew exactly what she had lost, and that was precisely why she was walking away forever. Charles Montgomery passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 weeks later, casting a pall of sorrow over the Hudson Valley, though Julian seemed far more preoccupied with the upcoming probate proceedings than mourning the man who had raised him. On the morning of the reading, Julian had brought Victoria directly into the family estate on his arm, intending to flaunt his newfound authority before the entire lineage and cement Victoria's place as the new lady of the house. But the entire meticulously constructed fantasy collapsed the moment Evelyn Montgomery struck her cane against the marble floor, demanding the presence of Clara Caldwell before a single legal word could be uttered. The Grand Library remained trapped in an agonizing, suspended silence as 30 minutes ticked away on the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Julian checked his gold wristwatch every few minutes, shifting restlessly in his seat, his earlier arrogance curdling into an irritable, defensive frustration. Victoria kept adjusting her pearl earrings, casting nervous glances at the closed mahogany doors, whispering venomous complaints about how inappropriate it was to stall a multi-million-dollar succession for an ex-wife. Just as Julian opened his mouth to demand that Arthur Vance proceed regardless of his grandmother's orders, the heavy double doors creaked open, and Thomas stepped aside with a dignified bow, announcing the arrival of Mrs. Clara Caldwell. Clara walked into the library with quiet, unhurried grace, wearing a simple beige woolen dress, her hair neatly fastened at the nape of her neck, carrying only a small leather handbag, and wearing no jewelry save for a vintage silver watch. There was not a trace of theatricality or hesitation in her stride. She did not look at the lavish paintings, the towering bookshelves, or the sea of expectant faces lining the room. She walked straight toward Evelyn, gently taking the elderly matriarch's outstretched hand with genuine warmth, before turning to nod respectfully at the attorney. Only then did her calm, steady gaze shift toward Julian and the woman sitting beside him, acknowledging their presence with nothing more than polite, detached indifference, as she softly stated that she had come solely out of respect for Evelyn's personal summons. Julian immediately pushed himself up from the sofa, his posture rigid, defensively snapping that no one had accused her of anything else, though the sharp edge in his voice betrayed his deep embarrassment. Victoria, unable to contain her mounting hostility, looked Clara up and down with a condescending smirk, remarking loudly that it was truly astonishing how quickly an estranged woman could find her way back to an estate the moment millions of dollars were placed upon the table. Clara did not flinch or raise her voice. She calmly met Victoria's spiteful gaze and replied that, had she been interested in the Montgomery fortune, she would have asked for a settlement months ago rather than leaving with only what belonged to her before the wedding. Victoria gasped, attempting to retort, but Evelyn brought her oak cane down once more, warning the uninvited guest that one more disrespectful word would result in her immediate removal by the security staff. Seeing his mistress silenced and humiliated, Julian's temper flared. He boldly took Victoria's hand in his own, holding it high in an arrogant display of defiance meant to demonstrate that no one in that room could dictate his personal choices. Clara watched the juvenile gesture without a flicker of pain or jealousy in her eyes, simply gesturing toward the attorney, and politely requesting that Arthur Vance begin the reading so that Evelyn would not be subjected to unnecessary strain. Arthur nodded with solemn professional gratitude, cleared his throat, adjusted his reading glasses, and retrieved the primary testamentary portfolio bearing the wax seal of Charles Montgomery. He unfolded the thick legal parchment and began reciting the preliminary administrative clauses of the estate with a clear, steady baritone voice. The first several clauses pertained to the loyal household staff, establishing substantial lifelong annuities for Thomas the butler, the estate groundskeepers, and the senior housekeepers, who had served the Montgomery family for over 3 decades. Generous endowments were also allocated to the Hudson Valley Children's Hospital, a historical preservation trust in Albany, and several secondary residential properties distributed among distant cousins and extended family members. Julian listened to these initial distributions with bored complacency, tapping his polished leather shoes against the rug, entirely unconcerned by these minor charitable deductions. In his mind, these were standard philanthropic obligations, and the true core of the Montgomery empire, the controlling shares of the shipping conglomerate, the vast investment portfolios, and the deed to the Hudson Valley estate, would inevitably bear his name. Victoria shared his careless confidence, leaning her shoulder slightly against Julian's arm, whispering in his ear about how beautiful the estate gardens would look once they redesigned the East Terrace in the coming spring. Clara, however, kept her eyes focused entirely on Evelyn, noticing that the elderly woman held her hands tightly clasped over the silver handle of her cane, showing no surprise at any of the terms being read aloud. It became unmistakably clear to Clara that Evelyn had been intimately involved in the drafting of these final wishes, a reality that Julian's blinding self-absorption prevented him from seeing. Arthur Vance paused briefly, took a slow sip of water from a crystal glass, and turned to the section concerning the primary real estate and the long-term stewardship of the family holdings. The attorney announced that Charles Montgomery had bequeathed the full exclusive lifetime estate, administration, and executive control of the entire Hudson Valley property, along with all associated residential land, solely to his surviving wife, Evelyn Montgomery. Julian let out a faint sigh of relief and smiled casually. He viewed his grandmother's lifetime tenure as a mere administrative formality, fully expecting that her advanced age would soon compel her to delegate all operational authority directly to him. Victoria whispered another reassurance, claiming that an elderly woman would have no interest in running a massive estate and would gladly hand over the reins within a matter of months. Clara could hear their hushed, dismissive chatter, feeling a profound sense of disgust at how both of them treated the matriarch's remaining years on Earth as nothing more than a minor temporary inconvenience on their path to total ownership. Arthur Vance carefully turned the next page of the ledger, his expression turning grave as he retrieved a separate, slender envelope, tied with a deep blue ribbon, bearing a notarized date barely 19 days prior to Charles Montgomery's death. The attorney announced that an official codicil had been executed, formally altering and superseding several key provisions regarding the primary corporate assets and the ultimate distribution of the family wealth. Julian's smile instantly vanished, his brow furrowing in sharp disbelief as he demanded to know what changes had been made and why he, as the chief operating vice president, had never been informed. Arthur looked over the rim of his glasses, replying in a crisp, unyielding tone that a testator's final deliberations were strictly confidential and required neither the consent nor the advance knowledge of any prospective beneficiary. Julian's heart hammered against his ribs as a cold, unfamiliar dread began to seep into his chest, shattering the arrogant certainty that had carried him through the past several months. He turned sharply toward his grandmother, his voice trembling with barely concealed indignation as he asked if she had been aware of this secret amendment behind his back. Evelyn met his gaze with absolute serenity, confirming that she had indeed known Charles was restructuring his affairs, though she had never once asked him to alter his personal judgment. Victoria slowly withdrew her hand from Julian's grasp, her eyes darting between the blue-ribboned envelope and the stoic faces of the family members, realizing for the first time that the golden future she had so meticulously planned might be hanging by an extraordinarily fragile thread. Arthur Vance explained that during his final 3 weeks of life, Charles Montgomery had requested 4 formal closed-door conferences with his legal team, his personal accountants, and independent corporate auditors. The patriarch had painstakingly reviewed recent financial transactions, administrative reports, and documented evidence regarding the conduct and character of those slated to carry the family legacy into the next generation. Julian shot up from his seat, demanding to know what kind of reports had been commissioned and who had authorized an investigation into his private life. Arthur declined to engage in personal arguments, reminding the room that his sworn duty was strictly to read the verified legal document precisely as it was drafted and signed under full testamentary capacity. Victoria leaned forward, her voice rising in a desperate attempt to invalidate the proceedings, suggesting aloud that Charles Montgomery had been bedridden, heavily medicated, and clearly unfit to understand the complex documents he was signing. Evelyn's cane struck the floor with terrifying force, her voice booming across the library as she warned Victoria never to question her late husband's brilliant mind, stating firmly that Charles had remained sharper and more lucid than anyone in that room until his very last breath. Arthur Vance corroborated the matriarch's words immediately, presenting notarized affidavits from 2 independent, board-certified neurologists from Columbia University Medical Center who had personally evaluated and certified Charles's sound mental capacity on the exact afternoon the codicil was executed. Clara sat quietly, a vivid memory from a month before Charles's passing suddenly resurfacing in her mind with profound, piercing clarity. She remembered sitting beside the patriarch by the large bay window, watching the autumn leaves fall across the lawn, when Charles had softly asked her why so many young men treated an inheritance as an inherent birthright rather than a solemn responsibility. She had gently replied that no one should ever feel entitled to claim ownership over the fruits of another person's lifelong labor before it was freely given. Charles had smiled a weary, knowing smile, remarking that pressure does not build a man's character. It merely strips away the polish and reveals what was hiding beneath all along. Sitting in that library, Clara finally understood that those quiet afternoon philosophical musings had not been the ramblings of a fading mind, but the deliberate calculations of a patriarch who had been observing his grandson far more closely than Julian had ever realized. Victoria, sensing the catastrophic shift in the room, suddenly pointed an accusatory finger directly at Clara, shrilly declaring to the entire gathering that this secret codicil was undeniably the result of Clara's sinister manipulation during her daily visits to the dying man. The library fell dead silent as the cruel accusation hung in the air, but Clara did not cower. She turned slowly to face her estranged husband, asking him directly if he truly shared his mistress's vile belief that her genuine care for his grandfather had been nothing more than a calculated financial scheme. Julian hesitated for several agonizing seconds, his eyes darting frantically across the room before he weakly mumbled that he simply wanted to understand how such a drastic change could occur without his knowledge. Clara shook her head slowly, a look of profound disappointment hardening her features as she told him to listen to his grandfather's words instead of interrogating the woman who had stood by his family while he was away living a lie. Evelyn added with icy precision that Clara had never once uttered a single question regarding the Montgomery estate, whereas Julian had submitted 5 separate formal inquiries to the corporate legal team regarding asset transfers, while his grandfather was still fighting for his life in the upstairs bedroom. Arthur Vance cleared his throat, raised his hand to restore absolute order, and began reading the personal preamble written by Charles Montgomery's own hand at the beginning of the sealed codicil. The late patriarch's written words resonated through the high-ceilinged room with devastating moral clarity. Charles stated that he had spent over 50 years building a vast enterprise intended to safeguard his family's honor, not to foster a brood of entitled predators waiting impatiently for his demise. He noted that over the preceding 3 years, he had observed disturbing behaviors that forced him to fundamentally reevaluate who possessed the requisite maturity, humility, and moral integrity to steward such immense wealth. Julian's skin lost all its color as the words sank in, while Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her polished facade cracking entirely as the reality of Charles Montgomery's posthumous judgment bore down upon them like a crushing weight. The document went on to reveal that Charles had received detailed logs from estate staff, corporate drivers, and trusted business associates regarding Julian's prolonged absences, his reckless corporate expenditures, and his brazen discussions regarding the liquidation of legacy assets. Julian angrily interrupted, shouting that preparing for future executive responsibilities was standard business practice, but Evelyn cut him off instantly, reminding him that true preparation meant learning at his grandfather's feet while he lived, not measuring the value of his coffin before he died. Arthur Vance then read the clause that shattered Victoria's composure entirely. Charles had noted that an heir who held the sacred dignity and loyalty of his own wife in utter contempt could never be trusted to honor the solemn obligations of a family legacy. Arthur turned to the decisive operational mandate regarding the Montgomery Maritime Shipping Enterprise and the Central Family Investment Trusts, announcing that full, unrestricted executive voting control and administrative power was permanently transferred to Evelyn Montgomery. The attorney explicitly clarified that this provision entirely revoked and nullified all prior wills, drafts, or corporate resolutions that had automatically designated Julian Montgomery as the succeeding chief executive officer upon his grandfather's passing. Julian blinked in utter shock, gripping the mahogany table with white knuckles, asking in a choked whisper what was left for him, to which Arthur solemnly replied that the personal clause dedicated exclusively to his name would be read immediately following the primary declarations. Before proceeding to Julian's specific clause, Arthur Vance indicated that Charles Montgomery had established a distinct, irrevocable bequest specifically designated for Clara Caldwell. Victoria leaped to her feet in a fury, screaming that the entire proceeding was a fraudulent farce engineered by an opportunist. But Clara stood up with quiet, commanding dignity, declaring that she had come solely out of love for Evelyn and had zero interest in fighting over a single dollar of the Montgomery fortune. Clara looked directly into Julian's hollow eyes, telling him that the most tragic part of this morning was not Victoria's desperate greed, but the fact that Julian had spent months projecting his own mercenary soul onto everyone who had ever truly loved him. Arthur unfolded the personal clause regarding the grandson, took a deep breath, and read the definitive legal sentence. After thorough consideration of his grandson's unrepentant conduct, Charles Montgomery had formally and completely excluded Julian Montgomery from receiving any direct personal inheritance, trust distribution, or corporate equity from his estate. Julian stood frozen in the center of the grand library, the silence that followed the attorney's words heavy enough to suffocate every breath in the room. The absolute legal exclusion felt like a physical blow to his chest, stripping away 34 years of untouchable entitlement in a fraction of a second. Victoria's hands dropped limply to her sides, her jaw slack, her eyes wide with unmasked panic, as she stared at the man whose grand promises had just vanished into thin air. Julian turned frantically to his grandmother, pleading with a cracking voice for her to tell him this was merely a temporary administrative test, a harsh lesson meant to frighten him into line. But Evelyn slowly shook her head, her eyes brimming with a sorrow far deeper than anger, stating that Charles had made his final decision to protect the family's legacy from being dismantled by a man who mistook arrogance for leadership. Desperation clawing at his throat, Julian demanded that Arthur Vance search through every file in his briefcase, insisting there had to be a secondary trust, a secret bank account, or a contingency clause that would automatically restore his inheritance upon his grandmother's passing. Arthur looked up with steady, uncompromising professionalism, informing him that Charles Montgomery had meticulously closed every conceivable legal loophole. There was no hidden reserve, no automatic succession, and no legal mechanism that would ever force Evelyn to surrender a single asset against her will. Julian's expression twisted from disbelief into a blinding, helpless rage as he paced the Persian rug, his hands trembling as he realized that the vast empire he had bragged about across the finest restaurants of Manhattan was now completely out of his reach. Arthur Vance continued reading the late patriarch's personal explanation, which detailed how Julian had repeatedly treated the family's wealth as an infinite shield against personal accountability, assuming his surname would forever insulate him from the consequences of his cruelty. Charles had written that a man who believes he can discard the sacred vows of marriage without a shred of remorse will inevitably treat his employees, his partners, and his community with the exact same callous disregard. When the document indirectly mentioned Julian's shameless public displays with Victoria, she turned crimson, whispering frantically to Julian that she had no idea the old man had been keeping track of their whereabouts. Julian didn't even look at her. His mind was violently replaying an afternoon in the study 2 months prior, remembering how he had casually brushed off his grandfather's inquiries about his marriage to talk about selling off a commercial property in Boston. Sitting beside Evelyn, Clara listened to the reading with a heavy, aching heart, finding no joy or vindication in the total destruction of her former husband's ambitions. She gently squeezed Evelyn's frail hand, leaning in to whisper a question about whether Charles had suffered deeply in his final weeks, carrying the burden of this painful decision. Evelyn nodded softly, confessing that Charles had wept bitter tears in private, not out of malice or a desire for revenge, but out of the profound grief of realizing that the grandson he had cherished had grown into a stranger, consumed entirely by vanity and greed. Evelyn looked at Julian and spoke with piercing clarity, reminding him that his grandfather had not sought to punish him for failing in love, but to prevent him from ever confusing inherited privilege with personal honor. Julian latched onto her words like a drowning man, desperately trying to shift the blame, loudly claiming that this catastrophic outcome was entirely Clara's fault for walking out on him and turning his grandparents against him. Clara rose from her chair, her voice ringing clear, calm, and unshakable across the room as she told him to stop hiding his own moral failures behind her name. She reminded him that she had never spoken a single ill word against him to Charles, that she had spent years covering for his prolonged absences, and that it was his own selfish choices that had written every single line of that codicil. Arthur Vance confirmed her statement under legal oath, verifying that Clara had never once attended a testamentary meeting, had never been consulted regarding the amendments, and had been kept entirely in the dark to preserve the absolute integrity of Charles's independent judgment. Arthur then turned to the independent bequest dedicated exclusively to Clara Caldwell, explaining that Charles had recognized her years of devoted, selfless care during his illness. Care given freely without a single demand for compensation, corporate status, or legal favor. As a genuine token of lifelong gratitude, Charles had bequeathed to Clara his personal, unencumbered, historic townhouse located on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, along with an independent, diversified investment portfolio established decades ago under his private name. This bequest was entirely separate from the Montgomery corporate assets, granting her complete financial independence without placing her in administrative conflict with Evelyn or the family business. Clara stood entirely motionless, the breath catching in her throat, instinctively murmuring that she could not possibly accept such an overwhelming gift from a family she had legally departed. Arthur smiled warmly, stating that Charles had anticipated her humble hesitation and had left a sealed personal letter addressed solely to her, requesting permission to read it aloud before the assembled family. Clara hesitated for a moment before nodding softly, and Arthur opened the small linen envelope, reading the patriarch's tender words to the woman he had loved like a granddaughter. Charles wrote that the gift was never intended to buy her affection or compensate for the deep wounds inflicted by Julian, for no amount of money could ever mend a broken heart. It was simply a grandfather's way of ensuring she remembered that her quiet grace, unwavering kindness, and moral courage had been seen, valued, and deeply cherished. He concluded by urging her never to return to a life of misery out of guilt or obligation, blessing her journey toward a future where her dignity would never again be compromised. As Arthur finished reading the letter, Clara closed her eyes as tears silently traced their way down her cheeks, while Evelyn reached up to embrace her, their shared grief and love transcending the cold legal proceedings of the morning. Across the table, Julian watched the tender embrace, with a sickening knot tightening in the pit of his stomach, completely shattered by the realization of what he had truly lost. For months, he had convinced himself that Clara stayed only for the Montgomery name, yet she had walked away with nothing, only to be freely gifted the very security he had tried to withhold from her. Victoria, meanwhile, stared intently at the financial folder containing the details of Clara's new investment portfolio, her sharp, calculating eyes betraying her obsessive focus on the monetary value rather than the profound emotional truth of the moment. Arthur Vance then presented a digital tablet to the room, explaining that Charles Montgomery had recorded a final, private video deposition in the presence of his medical evaluators to permanently extinguish any legal challenges. On the high-definition screen, Charles appeared seated in his favorite leather armchair by the library window, looking frail and weathered, yet his eyes burning with sharp, unmistakable clarity. Looking directly into the camera lens, the patriarch calmly stated that he had acted entirely of his own free will, concluding with a single haunting challenge. If his grandson truly believed this testament was unjust, he should first ask his own conscience how many times he had visited his dying grandfather without a business contract in his hand. The video faded to black, leaving the library in a state of absolute, unassailable silence. Julian dropped his head into his hands, unable to utter a single word of defense, knowing in the depths of his soul that his grandfather's words were an unvarnished truth. Over the past 12 months, his visits had been nothing more than hurried, 5-minute interruptions between corporate flights, spent checking stock tickers on his smartphone rather than asking about his grandfather's failing heart. Victoria leaned close to his ear, her voice now tight and frantic, hissing that he could not simply accept this humiliation and demanding that he immediately hire the most aggressive trial attorneys in Manhattan to contest the will. Julian slowly raised his head, looking at Victoria as if seeing her true nature for the very first time in his life, asking her with a hollow, bitter tone what she honestly expected to gain from dragging his family's grief through a scandalous public courtroom. Victoria fumbled for words, stammering that she only wanted him to reclaim what rightfully belonged to him. But Julian remembered with crushing clarity that his grandfather had never made a single formal promise of wealth. He had spent months bragging to Victoria, filling her head with grand illusions of estates, private jets, and untouchable power. And now that the illusion was dead, the foundation of their entire relationship was crumbling before his eyes. Julian turned to Clara and asked in a strained, pathetic whisper how much the Upper West Side townhouse and the private portfolio were worth, a question so grotesquely inappropriate that Evelyn looked at him with an expression of complete, heartbroken disgust. Clara looked at him not with anger, but with overwhelming pity, softly telling him that even after witnessing his own downfall, his soul was still so thoroughly impoverished that his only instinct was to calculate the price tag of another person's peace. Arthur Vance formally closed his leather briefcase, the sharp metallic snap of the brass locks signaling the definitive conclusion of the proceedings. Victoria grabbed her designer handbag from the sofa, the polished charm entirely replaced by an ugly, defensive scowl, declaring that she refused to sit in that room another minute, listening to self-righteous lectures. Julian looked at her in disbelief, asking if she was really abandoning him the very second his fortune disappeared, to which she let out a harsh, cruel laugh, replying that she had fallen for a powerful, confident man with an empire, not a disinherited failure who blamed everyone else for his own shortcomings. She reached into her purse, pulled out a diamond tennis bracelet Julian had bought her using his corporate account, threw it onto the mahogany table with a sickening clatter, and marched toward the exit without looking back once. As Victoria reached the double doors, Evelyn Montgomery's stern voice halted her in her tracks, informing her that the estate staff had already been instructed to pack whatever personal items she had left in the guest quarters, and that security would ensure she never set foot on Montgomery land again. Victoria flushed with rage, offered no parting words, and stormed down the hallway, the aggressive click of her high heels fading into the distance until the heavy front oak doors slammed shut behind her. Julian stood completely alone in the center of the vast room, having sacrificed his marriage, his family, and his grandfather's trust for a woman who discarded him like a worthless trinket the moment his bank accounts were closed. Looking around the grand room that had been his home since childhood, he turned to his grandmother and quietly mumbled that he would need a few days to pack his things and figure out where he was going to live. Evelyn Montgomery rose slowly from her high-backed chair, leaning heavily upon her oak cane, her face etched with sorrow but her voice immovable as iron. She looked at her grandson and stated firmly that he would not be staying a few days, that he was packing his bags and leaving the Montgomery estate that very afternoon. Julian stared at her in utter disbelief, exclaiming that he was her own flesh and blood, that he had lived in this house his entire life. But Evelyn replied that growing up under a roof did not make one the owner of the soul within it. She told him that she and Charles had spent decades cushioning every single one of his falls, bailing him out of reckless mistakes, and that continuing to shield him today would be the ultimate betrayal of his grandfather's dying wish. Julian looked desperately at Clara, silently begging for an intervention, remembering all the times she had smoothed over his conflicts with his grandparents in the past. But Clara remained silent, knowing that true healing could never begin as long as Julian was allowed to escape the reality of his own actions. With a heavy, defeated sigh, Julian walked up the grand staircase under the watchful eye of Thomas the butler, who had been instructed to ensure that only strictly personal belongings were removed from the master suite. While Julian was upstairs, Clara gently asked Evelyn if she was certain about casting him out so abruptly, to which the elderly matriarch softly replied that she would always love her grandson with all her heart, but loving someone did not mean handing them a fortress from which they could continue destroying themselves and everyone around them. 20 minutes later, Julian descended the marble staircase carrying 2 modest leather suitcases, his designer suit rumpled, his face pale and haggard. He stopped before the 2 women, looking at Clara with an expression of bitter exhaustion, asking if she was finally satisfied now that she held a fortune and the total devotion of his family. Clara stood up slowly, looked him directly in the eyes, and reminded him that she had walked out of that very front door weeks ago with her suitcases in hand, fully believing he would inherit every single penny of the Montgomery empire. She told him never to insult her integrity by claiming money had dictated her choices, because she had chosen her dignity when she had nothing, whereas he had lost everything because he believed money could replace a human soul. Evelyn stepped forward, gently placing a weathered hand against Julian's cheek, telling him that the day he could look in the mirror and say, "I caused this," without blaming Clara, Victoria, or his grandfather, the door to her heart would be open to talk. She withdrew her hand and told him that until that day arrived, he would have to learn to live on what he built with his own two hands, rather than what he expected to inherit from the dead. Julian choked back a wave of bitter tears, turned toward the grand entrance, and walked out into the crisp, biting afternoon air of the Hudson Valley. Outside, a light rain was beginning to fall over the sweeping lawns, and as Julian walked down the long gravel driveway, he saw a hired sedan waiting near the iron gates. The corporate limousine he had always used had been officially revoked by the estate trustees. Clara stepped out onto the wide stone porch, watching his solitary figure walk toward the gates, the weight of the past decade settling into a profound, peaceful stillness within her chest. Julian turned back for a brief moment, seeing her standing beside the grand stone pillars, and for a fleeting second, he wondered if she was going to call him back to offer some comforting words to soften the crushing blow. Clara maintained a respectful distance, speaking softly through the cool breeze, assuring him that she harbored no hatred toward him, but explaining that not wishing for his destruction was entirely different from ever wanting to be his wife again. Julian bowed his head, realizing that the grandfather he had neglected had finally taught him the most painful lesson of his life. He had spent his entire existence believing everything around him was a permanent possession, only to discover that honor, love, and respect were merely on loan, easily reclaimed the moment they were taken for granted. The transition of the seasons over the following year brought a quiet, restorative rhythm back to the historic Hudson Valley estate. In the initial months following the reading of the will, Julian Montgomery retreated entirely to a modest two-bedroom apartment he privately owned in downtown White Plains, throwing himself into the mid-sized logistics consultancy he had founded independently years prior. He was by no means destitute, but the intoxicating aura of untouchable wealth that had once shielded him from reality was completely gone. Former business associates who had eagerly sought his company at Manhattan charity galas stopped returning his calls with urgency. Country club invitations dried up, and Victoria Cross vanished entirely from his social circle, later rumored to be pursuing a wealthy real estate developer in South Florida. Clara Caldwell, meanwhile, handled her unexpected inheritance with the same understated grace that had defined her entire life. She finalized the legal transfer of the Upper West Side townhouse and the private investment portfolio, but she flatly refused to alter her lifestyle or indulge in ostentatious displays of newfound wealth. Instead of moving into the opulent multi-story residence, she partnered with a reputable nonprofit foundation in Manhattan, converting the historic brownstone into a community center and transitional housing facility for elderly women facing housing insecurity. Clara spent 2 days a week visiting Evelyn at the Hudson Valley estate, sharing quiet afternoon teas in the sunlit library where Charles had spent his final days, maintaining a bond of pure, familial love that required neither a legal contract nor a shared surname to endure. One crisp afternoon in late October, exactly 11 months after Charles Montgomery's passing, the family gathered at the estate for a private, intimate memorial service to dedicate a commemorative bronze plaque in the late patriarch's beloved library. Julian arrived unaccompanied, wearing a simple navy blazer without expensive jewelry, his posture subdued and his demeanor noticeably humble as he stood quietly before his grandfather's old mahogany desk. When Clara entered the room to arrange a vase of fresh autumn flowers, Julian turned to her with a gentle, sorrowful smile, admitting that he would give every dollar he ever made just to have one more quiet afternoon to sit and talk with the man who had tried so desperately to guide him. Clara looked at him with genuine warmth and softly replied that while he could never bring back the past, he still had the precious gift of time to spend with the family members who were still alive and waiting for him to grow. Julian took her words to heart, walking out of the study and going straight to sit beside Evelyn on the sofa, listening with patient, respectful attentiveness as the elderly matriarch shared stories of Charles's early struggles building the shipping line from a single wooden dock in Brooklyn. When the memorial concluded and the few guests prepared to leave, Evelyn walked her grandson to the front door, offering him a warm, tender smile and inviting him to join her for family dinner the following Sunday, provided he came solely to be her grandson rather than to discuss corporate assets. Julian hugged his grandmother with deep, tearful gratitude, finally understanding that the greatest inheritance a family could ever bestow was not written on legal parchment, but forged in the quiet, unconditional moments of shared humanity, forgiveness, and mutual respect. Life has a profound and often humbling way of reminding us that the truest measure of our existence is never found in the titles we inherit, the wealth we accumulate, or the power we wield over those around us. As the years advance and the fleeting illusions of youth begin to fade, we inevitably discover that genuine dignity cannot be purchased in the marketplace, nor can authentic love be enforced through legal contracts, financial dependence, or manipulative control. We often spend the first half of our lives frantically gathering possessions, building towering fortresses of pride, and foolishly believing that our standing in the world is defined by what we own rather than who we are when everything is stripped away. Yet, in the quiet twilight of our journeys, when the noise of ambition finally subsides, the soul is confronted with an unvarnished and inescapable truth. Everything material is merely on loan to us for a brief, fleeting season, while the only treasures that truly endure are the integrity of our character, the depth of our compassion, and the quiet sacrifices we make when no one is watching. To walk away from a life of toxic privilege in order to preserve one's sacred self-respect is not a defeat, but the greatest victory a human spirit can ever achieve. For when we stop confusing temporary entitlement with permanent worth, we finally open our hearts to a peace that the world can neither give nor ever take away.